Welcome to round 4 of the Paris Rapid and Blitz, Grand Chess Tour 2021. Uh, this round 4, had a series of flat games. Almost all the other 4 games were draw, and this is the only game that had a result. And this is the game between the Frenchmen, the number 1 Vachier-Lagrave Maxime, MVL, the number 1 French GM, versus the former number 1 French GM, Bacrot Etienne Bacrot. In this game, we had MVL start of the game with a B3, unorthodox opening. Nimzalasan attack and knight F6 was Etienne's response. That's the Indian variation. We had bishop b2, g6, bishop g6, g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, castling the king side by black. We had c4, d6, e3, knight c6. That seems to be the first naturals of the game. Perhaps best would have been e5. So the game would have continued as knight c3, rook e8, d6, c6, and everything is almost equal here. Knight f3, knight s6, castling queen kingside, d5, c times d6, and perhaps the c pawn would recapture, or even the knight, but that didn't happen. So after knight c6, which was the first in accuracy, we had MVA reply with a knight e2. We had e5, knight b to c3. We had bishop e6, castling king side by MVL. Queen d7. Now, what this move signifies is it's looking at this diagonal. It's looking at exchanging out this fianchetto bishop, but MVL is not worried about that. He welcomes it. And we have knight d5. We had bishop h3, bishop captures h3, and then queen recaptures on h3. Knight captures on f6 check. We had bishop recapturing on f6. We had f4. Bishop drops back to g7. f5. G captures on f5. Knight c3. We had knight e7 by black. Then knight d5 is here, so knight captures the knight on d5, c recaptures on d5. We had rook a to c8 to protect the c7 pawn and perhaps set it in motion. Rook c1, we have queen g6, g4 rather. We had queen g4. What this does is queen g4. Now what queen g4 does is just in case white tries to capture the g4 queen or the queen on g4, then black gets to repair his pawns. MVL is not about to make that mistake, so he leaves that to Tien, and he plays rook c4 to force the queen away. So the queen has to capture on d1, and rook recaptures on d1. We have c5, rook back to f1 to attack the pawn on f5. We have b5, rook h4, c4 to try and create a pass pawn at least. We had b4, f4, g captures f4, then we have f5, rook h5. We had rook c to d8, bishop c3 to stop, to try and blockade the c4 pawn. That's a good square for the bishop as well. We have rook d7, f captures on e5, d captures on e5, and that means the d5 pawn is under attack. We had rook f capturing on f5, rook recaptures on f5, and rook recaptures on f5 as well. We had then rook capturing on d5, king f2. Now the position is almost equal. We had rook d3, which is a little bit of an inaccuracy. Rook d6 would have been a much better move to keep things at par. You know, you play rook d6 and then attack from this side. You'd play here, attack from here, and attack this pawn. This would be defenseless. Just to show you that that's how it would be. Then you're ready to play rook to s6 and attack the f5 pawn. That did not happen though. So he played rook d6. We had king e2, s6, king d1, h6. We had rook f2. Then we had rook d7. We had rook f1, king h7, king c2, king g6. F4 is on the move to try and break up the chain. Here, bishop f6. We then had a capturing on b5, and the a pawn recaptures on b5. Rook a1 to get to the open file. Now, what this rook intends to do is intends to play either here or, but the main important is if you play rook behind this pawn, what if you play this rook behind that pawn, what this move does is he will play straight up here, then capture here. So Etienne sees that in advance and he plays, rook to the 6th rank first. So when he plays to attack the b pawn, you play right behind the b pawn. You play rook to b6. We had king d1, king f5, king e2, king g4. He's doing all it takes to attack the f pawn, to attack the h pawn rather. Rook a8, king h6, king h, rook a8. We have king h3, king f3. We have king capturing on h2, rook g8. We have that push of h5, rook g6. We now have rook d6, king e4. We have king h3, king f5. Bishop moves out of the way to e7 while protecting the rook as well. Rook g7, bishop f8 attacking the rook. Rook g8, bishop h6. Now, bishop h6 is a little bit of an inaccuracy. The best would have been to maintain more equality would have been rook d8. Yep, would have been rook d8. So that player would continue this way. Player would continue this way, and this is drawish. However, after bishop h6, we had rook king capturing on e5, which is also another inaccuracy. Best would have been rook h8, so that player would continue this way. You would have white having some sort of advantage here, and this is perhaps a minimum advantage for white, but sufficient enough could build into a win. However, after king capturing on e5. We then had rook d3, king e4, and bishop captured on e3. D captured back on e3, and rook captured c3. We had rook g5, h4, rook captures b5, and rook c1. We then had rook g5, king h2, king d4, h3. We have b5, c3. We had b6, rush for crowning. Rook b1, king captures on c3, rook captures on b6. We had king d4, rook b4 check, king d3, rook b2, king e4. Now this is a very serious endgame. This is a rook ending whereby you have to be so endings are really so tricky. Any slight switch off, you just can't assume things are drawish. No, because you have pawns on different ranks and flanks, so you have to be so keen, and whoever has the most active rook perhaps always wins. So we had king e4, rook g2 to try and force an exchange of rooks since his pawn is so advanced. Black's pawn is so advanced. MVL is not entertaining this. He plays rook h5. Now, here we had king g3 to move out of the way for the queening pawn. Then this is when a mistake was played. King e5. Best would have been rook h8. Let's take it back. Had he played rook h8, that would maintain equality, but he didn't play that. So we had, king e5, a big mistake, and Etienne capitalized on this by playing rook e2. Such a good move. We then had rook h8. At this point, we had the first check of rook f5 check. King has to move to f6. Rook f4. What he wants is he wants to play this rook behind the pawn, and then have this pawn, queening. Because once you play the rook behind this pawn, then for some reason you'll have this pawn going all the way to queening. Yes, so we then had f5, and at this point we had rook h4 as anticipated. We then had rook g8 check, and at this point it's all lost. We had king f2 and king e5. Best should have been king g5, but still that wouldn't do much because it's a lost game. Just so if we can, it wouldn't do much because at this point you just have to sidestep and have the pawn queen. This is how it's done. Play that. You play this, you play here, you play here, and you got queen. This is immune. You can't pick this pawn. You then learn into that check. Try to go back, check how it would be. So as of move 69, MVA resigned and Etienne crowned the game. Such an interesting game in this round. It was the only board that had a result. All the other boards ended in a draw. Congrats to Etienne for beating his fellow countryman and the #1 GM in his country. Thank you for watching. Join me in the next video while analyzing games of the other rounds for this grand chess tour. See you in the next video.